You mean to tell me that the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan is to have the Afghans keep walking into machine gun fire till the Russians run out of bullets?
That's Harold Holt's strategy. It's not U.S. strategy.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the most disastrous mistakes in human history and the devastating ripple effects they unleashed.
He says to follow the cross-down instructions.
So then why are they crossed down?
Number 30. Diocletian splits Rome into East and West.
He wants to destroy the Republic and rule Rome as a bloody tyrant! That's why!
The Roman Empire became increasingly large in its early years, so much so that Emperor Diocletian decided to divide it into two in the late 3rd century. This was intended to make it easier to govern, but it instead caused its decline. While this decision provided short-term stability by streamlining the empire's administration, it also created two separate power centers with different priorities. The Eastern Empire received Egypt, the wealthiest province, while the West struggled to sustain itself economically. Over time, this separation weakened the cohesion of the Roman Empire and made it increasingly difficult to manage. Eventually, Rome lost most of its western provinces, culminating in the erosion of control in Italy, when the empire fell to the Normans in 1071. Number 29. King Leopold II's rush to Africa.
The limbs and lives of millions of Congolese were brutally lost for the insatiable demands of King Leopold II, who governed this territory as his personal property.
The scramble for Africa remains one of the most appalling European ventures of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution paved the way for Europeans to expand aggressively across the globe, often resorting to exploitation and violence. Among them was Belgian King Leopold II, who claimed sole ownership over the Congo Free State in 1885. His regime became infamous for its widespread atrocities and for plundering the nation's resources, while offering little benefit to its people. In fact, Leopold's government forced the Congolese people to extract rubber from their own land and punished those who failed to meet quotas with torture and mutilation. It was a private extraction economy, fueled by human suffering.
The Africans were put on display so people could go and see them in very much the same way that they could look at, say, caged animals in a zoo, and their reactions were also very similar.
Number 28. Sending Diego de Landa to convert the Yucatan Peninsula. Diego de Landa was a Spanish Catholic missionary sent to the Yucatan Peninsula to convert the Maya people to Christianity. Once there, he sought to completely erase the indigenous beliefs, which he deemed heretical. In 1562, he ordered the burning of thousands of Maya books, claiming they were, quote, superstition and lies of the devil. This became known as the tragedy at Mani, and it erased tons of information about American history. In addition to this, Landa oversaw the torture of Maya people who refused conversion. His methods were so despicable that he was eventually recalled to Spain and put on trial for his illegal inquisition.
This is our one and only opportunity to peer into the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans and hear these people speaking to us.
Number 27. Romanos IV recruiting a diverse army. The Roman Empire spent centuries of the medieval era fighting off Islamic invasions from the east. The Roman Seljuk border on the edge of Anatolia became the Roman Wild West, inspiring epic poems called the Acritic Songs. This all went downhill in 1071 when Romanos IV entered battle with the Seljuk Empire at Manzikert. His biggest mistake was recruiting a highly diverse army, composed of mercenaries from various backgrounds with no loyalties to the empire. This led to a military disaster, or even deserting to the Turkic side, which wasn't surprising given that many were Turkic themselves. Rome never fully regained control of Anatolia, a region it had called home for over 1,000 years.
I am in your debt. Ask me for anything, and I will provide it.
Anything.
Anything.
Number 26. Jefferson removing an anti-slavery passage from the Declaration of Independence.
When he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That was the first time anybody had bothered to write that down.
And then you turn the clock back and think of when he was writing, how young he was.
The Founding Fathers fought hard to establish equality for all. It just so happened that equality prioritized white property-owning males over others. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence was more progressive than the final document, with Jefferson including a passage condemning slavery.
Every single word was precisely chosen. I assure you of that, Dr. Franklin.
Yes, but yours will not be the only hand in this document. It cannot be.
It referred to the practice as a, quote, cruel war against human nature, which was ironic considering Jefferson himself owned hundreds of slaves, but at least it was a step in the right direction. However, the omission of this passage allowed the cruel act to continue for decades and sowed the seeds of conflict that would later blossom into the Civil War. As a result, the eventual abolition of slavery was far more violent than it could have been.
I think he was a great founding father, but I also know that he enslaved many of my ancestors.
Number 25, Titanic Untested.
If there's the slightest bit of haze, we shall have to slow down. Let me know at once if you're doubtful. Aye, aye, sir.
The RMS Titanic was tested multiple times before its maiden voyage and was deemed unsinkable. The vessel was an extraordinary feat of engineering, and the initial trials went remarkably well, with the ship successfully sailing down the River Lagan in 1911. Subsequent sea tests in 1912 successfully confirmed her speed and structure.
And of course, what had happened, we slipped over the iceberg, and although she was supposed to be unsinkable with a double bottom, the iceberg had cut her from forward on the starboard side to the engine room.
Unfortunately, these all overlooked the real-world extreme conditions. For example, the watertight compartments only reached the D-deck, meaning if water overflowed into upper compartments, it was doomed. Some argue that the disaster resulted from speeding at night, or turning into the iceberg rather than hitting it head-on, which only prolonged the collision. Ultimately, if it had only been tested more thoroughly, the tragedy might have been prevented.
The bow section planes away, landing about a half a mile away, going 20-30 knots when it hits the ocean floor.
Number 24, King Charles I dissolving Parliament.
And he stepped through a window to a huge crowd, all of whom must have been very used to the idea of public execution, but nothing like this.
The divine right of kings proved to be a myth when King Charles I was executed in 1649. This incident was spearheaded by Oliver Cromwell, whose revolutionary actions stemmed from the king's repeated dissolutions of Parliament. Charles did this in part after trying to secure funds for his wars abroad, and Parliament refused to comply. He then began imposing forced loans, putting people who refused to pay in prison.
On one side of the war were the royalists who supported Charles's position as supreme ruler. On the other were members of Parliament who believed that their king was too powerful.
Eventually, they passed the Petition of Right, seeking to limit his power, but Charles simply dissolved them and ruled without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the 11 Years' Tyranny. His defiance culminated in the English Civil War in 1642, which was ignited by his relentless disregard for democracy.
Mr. Speaker, you will inform the members of this House that their presence is no longer required by the nation. This Parliament is, by my authority, terminated, dissolved.
Number 23, Operation Cyclone.
The CIA has more advanced weaponry available, but is wary of tipping their hand to Moscow. If the Soviets learn of America's secret involvement in Afghanistan, it could escalate into nuclear war.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan began in 1979, lasting an entire decade. America was vehemently opposed to communism and sought to prevent Soviet success. This is where Operation Cyclone comes in. It was a covert CIA operation that provided financial and military aid to the Afghan Mujahideen fighters. While the Mujahideen ultimately prevailed, this operation unintentionally fostered the rise of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
They understand that whoever comes in there ultimately wishes they hadn't, because nobody else ever stayed, ever.
After the war, the absence of a stable government caused a civil war, paving the way for a violent Taliban regime, notorious for human rights violations and collusion with terrorist groups. The region is still unstable today, and there have been numerous attacks on America since, orchestrated by the very groups it funded.
There was wild jubilation inside the country of Afghanistan as last weekend it became the first country in history to defeat the mighty Soviet Union.
Number 22, Lenin installing himself as a dictator.
Lenin didn't want to get involved with a movement that wasn't close to his ideas and under his control from the beginning. His idea of revolution was that it should be something which would be organized and disciplined and led by a revolutionary vanguard.
Vladimir Lenin was a passionate revolutionary who helped overthrow the Tsar in the February Revolution of 1917. The Constituent Assembly was democratically elected, intended to be Russia's new form of government. This was monumental since it was the first ever election in Russian history.
This is how we knew him, this is how we remember him, and this is the way he will live down the ages.
The assembly didn't last long, however, as it was dissolved by Lenin shortly after its first session commenced, when the Bolsheviks failed to secure a majority. His seizure of power set the stage for the Soviet Union's totalitarian regime, with Lenin establishing the secret police and laying the foundations for Stalin's subsequent reign of terror. Number 21, Louis XVI's financial aid to America.
When I return from St. Cloud, you can be sure that I will resume my regime, and hopefully everything will go swimmingly.
During the American Revolution, Louis XVI decided to provide substantial financial and military aid to the 13 colonies. While the support played a crucial role in securing the Americans' victory, it severely crippled France's economy. The effort cost the country 1.8 billion livres, which was more than double their annual income.
America bankrupts France, in effect, because the debt which the French monarchy incurs in order to fight the American War of Independence turns out to be absolutely crucial in the financial situation of the French monarchy.
This caused a further strain on an economy that was already burdened by massive debt from the 7 Years' War. By 1789, Louis XVI had hiked taxes massively, igniting the French Revolution. Of course, there were a myriad of factors that contributed to the uprising, like deep social inequalities and harvest failures. But funding the American Revolution was a disastrous miscalculation.
Are you admiring your Lime Avenue?
I'm saying goodbye.
Number 20, the Bay of Pigs invasion.
As the sun rises, there is a surprise attack from Castro's Air Force. The B-26s are shot down.
In April 1961, the United States of America aided anti-Castro Cuban exiles in an invasion of their former country. It was a complete disaster. The Cubans knew they were coming thanks to some loose lips by the exiles. And the CIA knew they knew, yet failed to inform President John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy could see all sorts of complications. There was no reason to believe that we could take Cuba over in a week.
Furthermore, the original invasion plan, which had been drafted under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, called for U.S. air and naval support, which Kennedy withheld after a certain point. The debacle only served to solidify Fidel Castro's rule, while also showing communist leaders worldwide that the U.S. could be defeated.
The enemy was confused. He had thought that our defense would crumble under the very first attack. He did not expect all the Cuban people to rise against him.
Oh, and it made possible the whole Cuban Missile Crisis thing. Number 19, the Donner Party's shortcut.
Early autumn snowstorms trapped the wagons, and they were forced to construct makeshift camps for the winter. The result was extreme suffering and starvation.
One of the most infamous pioneering groups in American history, the Donner Party consisted of 87 settlers who set out for California in the 1840s. By the time they reached their destination, only 48 remained, thanks to a multitude of costly errors. They set out too late in the season, leading to unfavorable weather throughout the journey. They were undersupplied and accepted more members as they went, leading to further shortages. They didn't have a guide and took a route that was untested. There was infighting and even murder within the party, and when the group was stranded by a blizzard in the Sierra Nevada mountains, some were forced to resort to cannibalizing their deceased members to survive. The Donner Party did everything wrong.
Some people came through it heroically. And some of the people in that party were far from heroes, and they got worse as the conditions got worse.
Number 18, Churchill decides to invade Gallipoli.
Has it been a success or hasn't it?
Well, it's hard to say, sir.
During the First World War, fighting had stalemated in Europe, and Russia was engaged with the Ottoman Empire in the Caucasus. Seeking to divert Central Powers forces from Europe and cut off the Ottomans, the Allies, with Winston Churchill spearheading it, decided to attack present-day Turkey. To reinforce naval forces, the Gallipoli Peninsula was invaded. The campaign was a colossal failure. The Allies drastically underestimated the Ottoman forces and used inexperienced troops and commanders, resulting in a 10-month-long engagement with over 500,000 men killed or wounded. The Allies were forced to retreat, with Britain's reputation suffering heavily over the debacle and Churchill losing his job. At least Turkey and the allied New Zealand and Australia gained some national pride over their roles.
Excuse me, sir. British are ashore at Suvla.
Are they meeting heavy opposition?
None, sir. Apparently they've called a halt and the officers are sitting on the beach drinking cups of tea.
Number 17, Battle of the Little Bighorn.
The village was always on the move. They knew the army was out after them. And to the United States Army, to capture a fleeing village was an impossible task.
Also known as Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn is one that has been romanticized in the folklore of the United States. However, General George Armstrong Custer's numerous mistakes have left its legacy far more muddled. In 1876, Custer met his end when attacking a force of Allied Plains Native Americans near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Custer was outnumbered and had split his forces into several smaller groups, and the Native Americans had superior rifles.
He realizes he doesn't have enough troops to do the job. He sends a rider south with a note calling for more men and more ammo.
Custer had rejected not only reinforcements, but also several Gatling guns, which may have turned the tide of battle. His decision to attack before the rest of the army arrived resulted in Custer's death, and the deaths of around half of his men.
Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and over 200 of his men annihilated in a defeat that devastated America in 1876.
Number 16, Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The Little Corporal's grand army of 680,000 soldiers strolled into Russia hoping for a quick and easy defeat, only to find the Russian forces to be constantly retreating. Using what's known as a scorched earth tactic, the Russians would burn down villages so that the pursuing French army would have no supplies to feed their vast numbers. Eventually, winter came, and the French forces were subject to starvation, hypothermia, and eventually, defeat. It was a harsh lesson, but one that every military leader has since taken to heart. Never underestimate the environmental factors when fighting on enemy soil. Number 15, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now it's time for the Russians, or in this case the Soviets, to take a beating, as the 1979 invasion of this Middle Eastern country was decidedly not a win for them. Wanting to protect communist interests in the country, the Soviets sent over 100,000 soldiers after the assassination of the president of the Afghanistan Communist Party. However, due to the alien nature of the communist way of life, an Afghani and Muslim resistance rose up with monetary aid from a certain Western capitalist arch-enemy of the Soviets. The ensuing conflict would result in the death of almost 15,000 Soviet soldiers, a Soviet withdrawal, and a continued civil war in the country. Number 14, the Spanish Armada's failed invasion of England.
The difficult question of how to transport a Spanish army safely to England in the face of a very strong and active English navy.
The summer of 1588 saw the formation of a Spanish Armada, which set sail for England in an attempt to overthrow Elizabeth I to restore Catholicism to the nation. However, the Spanish and Portuguese vessels were engaged in the English Channel by an English and Dutch armada. Although the Spanish Armada had larger ships and more men, the defenders had more ships that were more maneuverable and better armed. The Spanish were defeated, forcing a retreat. Not only did they fail to restore Catholics to power in England, but their failure arguably emboldened Protestants across Europe and led to the decline of Spain as an international power.
Now Drake had proved that the English designed warship was superior to anything that the Spanish or anyone else could put to sea.
Number 13, the Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent III called for the retaking of Jerusalem by Christians. The Holy City was then Muslim-controlled, and the plan was to attack the Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt, the largest Muslim empire at the time. However, a series of blunders led to the Crusaders doing nearly the opposite of their stated goal. When not enough Crusaders embarked from Venice, the army that arrived there could not pay for passage. Furthermore, these same Crusaders sacked Zara, a Catholic city, under Venice's instruction to recoup their investment. The Pope excommunicated them. Then, these Crusaders retook the Orthodox Christian-controlled Constantinople for Alexios IV, who promised them support in retaking Jerusalem. However, they sacked the city when he was deposed. The Fourth Crusade only served to weaken Christian-controlled Byzantium. Number 12, the Chernobyl Meltdown.
Comrade Diadlov, I apologize, but what you're saying makes no sense.
Raise the power.
No. I won't do it. It isn't safe.
The Chernobyl nuclear disaster is arguably the world's worst nuclear incident that wasn't intentional. On April 26, 1986, the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a safety test. While the disaster was partly the result of failures in Soviet safety procedures and the design of the reactor itself, operator error also played a major factor. Extreme conditions were created due to the negligence of those in charge. Additionally, the test was conducted by the less experienced night shift at the plant instead of the day shift. The end result was an unprecedented catastrophe that, had it not been contained, could have poisoned most of Eastern Europe.
At long last we have arrived. 1:23:45, explosion.
Number 11. Hernán Cortez's alliance with the Aztecs' enemies.
"What rational beings live here," wrote Cortez. "This is the best and richest land that ever there was."
The Aztec Empire once ruled a vast and culturally diverse region of Mesoamerica, home to roughly 6 million people at its greatest extent. Hernán Cortez, a Spanish explorer, arrived in Mexico in 1519 on a mapping expedition. He quickly realized how politically fragmented the region was and allied with some of the Aztecs' enemies, of which there were many.
He was a poor boy from the small town of Medellín, trained not in war, but in law.
Although Cortez brought just over 2,000 Spaniards, these alliances swelled his forces to well over 100,000 soldiers. Their superior technology and immune systems decimated the Aztecs in 1521 and resulted in a full-blown cultural genocide of the indigenous peoples.
Soy don Hernando Cortés, gobernador y capitán general en la Nueva España del Mar Océano, por obra y gracia de esta mano y de mis propias palabras.
Number 10. Mao's Great Leap Forward. Murdering millions of your own people is always a bad idea, but that's just what happened in China during the early to mid-20th century. In an attempt to rapidly industrialize the nation, the communist leaders tried to institute a demand for crops that the people could not meet. The resulting famine caused deaths around the country. However, famine was not the only cause of death during the Great Leap. Many reports of torture, beatings, and people taking their own lives have surfaced throughout the years. An exact death toll is nigh impossible to nail down, but it's been estimated at anywhere between 23 and 55 million people. And no amount of progress is worth such a steep cost. Number 9. The toppling of Muhammad Mosadek in Iran. Once again, we travel to the Middle East, but this time it's some devotees of capitalism that would make the mistake. The mission was known as Ajax in the US and Operation Boot in the UK, but the principles were the same: protect Western oil interests in Iran. How? By overthrowing the democratically elected prime minister and installing a monarch more sympathetic to the US's and the UK's demands. That's exactly what they did. The CIA even hired local mobsters to incite riots. What followed was the death and subjugation of many of the Iranian people, and a period of unrest that would eventually lead to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Number 8. Escalating the Vietnam War.
General, will this entail any offensive operations?
No, I don't believe it will.
In the 1960s, communism was spreading to Southeast Asia, and the prospect of a country willingly embracing it was intolerable to the West. In 1956, an election to unify Vietnam was scheduled, but the United States, supposed champions of the free world, opposed it for fear of communism being democratically and peacefully adopted. Eventually, in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, involving alleged attacks on U.S. Navy ships by North Vietnamese patrol boats.
The disillusionment for me began when I was going back to fight at places we'd already fought before. We had fought, captured, and then left, and the enemy came right back.
One of these attacks apparently didn't even happen, but that didn't seem to matter. The U.S. used it as a pretext to escalate things further, and eventually became embroiled in one of their bloodiest wars. The conflict claimed 58,000 American lives and over 1 million Vietnamese. Number 7. George W. Bush invading Iraq in 2003. Whether you believe it was motivated by weapons of mass destruction, the 9/11 attacks, or a need for oil, we can all agree that this 2003 attack on the Middle East was divisive for the American people and devastating for the Iraqi. It kicked off a costly 8+ year Iraq war, which, rather than fighting terrorism, arguably fostered it, most notably giving rise to ISIS. On the home front, it turned America into a nation divided, with one half of the population supporting the war and the other half vehemently against it. In other words, some were a little bit country and some were a little bit rock and roll. Shout out to South Park fans. Number 6. Austria Hungary decides to start a war. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by Bosnian Serb nationalists. Austria Hungary couldn't let the killing of their next ruler go lightly and decided to attack Serbia in retaliation. However, with Russia allied with Serbia, they wanted support from Germany in any conflict. By delaying their attack, Austria-Hungary ensured that Russia and its allies, France and later the United Kingdom, entered the conflict as well. All these events spiraled into the First World War. Granted, advances in military technology and the numerous European alliances ensured a massive conflict was bound to break out. But Austria-Hungary was the first to declare war. Number 5. Russia invades Ukraine.
The denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. That was his outrageous justification for all this. The first based on a lie, the second a euphemism for invasion.
Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Despite Russian claims of Ukrainian Nazism, it was more likely to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Regardless of the reasons, the invasion has been costly for both countries and the world economy. Tens of thousands have been killed on both sides. A refugee crisis has developed, not only in Ukraine but also in Europe, as thousands seek to flee the draft.
We are not afraid. We are ready to defend our country.
Plus, countries worldwide have imposed sanctions on Russia, destroying its economy. This is an ongoing conflict, so the full extent of how bad a decision it is cannot be stated at this time. However, even the ramifications thus far are horrendous.
This road lined with Russian tanks, destroyed when the Ukrainians were able to take this town back.
Number 4. Japan brings the United States into World War II.
All the fighting's confined to this area. As you can see, this is their road to Australia, and this is their way of controlling the sea lanes to America.
During World War II, Japan had invaded China and Korea. This prompted harsh sanctions from the USA, Britain, and the Dutch, who all had territory in the Pacific and/or ties to China. This effectively robbed them of many necessary resources, including oil. Rather than lose face by withdrawing, Japan decided to declare war on the United States, attacking Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941. This was a huge mistake. The USA retaliated with a costly and brutal war in the Pacific, leading to millions of deaths and the only instance of nuclear weapons used in warfare. The long-term effects on Japan were immense and still ripple through the country today.
Look at them all. I mean, we chewed them up. They just kept on coming.
Number 3. Hitler invading Russia. There's a quote that reads, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And that's exactly what the Nazis did in 1941. Despite studying Napoleon's first invasion of Russia as reference, the Nazis' attempted invasion of the Soviet Union resulted in a catastrophic loss of life. And in the eyes of many, it was the downfall of the Third Reich. Just like Napoleon, they planned on achieving a swift victory that never came. Operation Barbarossa, as it would come to be known, lasted over 5 months and resulted in over 5 million deaths. Number 2. Angering Genghis Khan. Many angered the Great Khan during his reign over the Mongol Empire, but none so spectacularly as the Alauddin Muhammad II, Shah of the Muslim Khwarezmian Empire. The result of infuriating the Khan meant the destruction of Alauddin's empire. But keep in mind that didn't have to be the case. Genghis wanted peace with the Shah, saying, quote, "I am master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace." The Shah refused, killing some Mongolian envoys. The result was, as previously stated, less than favorable for the Shah. It just goes to show, never mess with a Mongol. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Number 1. The victorious Allies impose harsh terms on Germany after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles. The moment that would define the next half of the 20th century. The moment that would lead to the rise of fascism, the Nazis, and eventually the Holocaust. After a long and brutal World War I, The victorious allies were tasked with punishing the losers, and punish them they did. The most important factor of the treaty was that Germany had to take total and complete blame for the war, which meant they had to disarm and pay reparations to all affected countries. This would virtually bankrupt the European country and set the stage for a very sinister time in human history. Which small decision do you think had the worst consequences for human history? Let us know in the comments section. Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.